Renowned as one of the finest fighting forces in the Imperium, no foe is too great and no mission too difficult for the Deathwing. These are the mailed fist of the Dark Angels, and even the mere sight of their bone armour is enough to send many enemies fleeing. In this video, we'll be showing you how to paint a Space Marine Terminator in the colours of the Deathwing. We'll be painting efficiently so that you'll be able to get your Deathwing army ready to defend the Imperium on the battlefield in no time. And by following this guide, you can easily transfer the techniques shown to any other Deathwing models in your collection. Before you know it, you'll have a whole army ready to go. If you're new to painting, you can check out the Citadel Colour Painting Essentials videos to learn more about it. The paints we've used are on screen now, and these are the colours of the Deathwing. But remember, you can paint your miniatures however you like. Also on screen now is any additional equipment that we've used. This includes brushes and mediums. However, feel free to use whatever brushes you're most comfortable with, and if you don't have mediums, you could switch this out with water instead. The first thing we need to do is undercoat our miniature, and for this we've chosen to use Wraithbone. This will set us up really well for the paint scheme ahead. So first of all, we're going to take a pot of Wraithbone, and we'll be painting this all over the miniature. This is a base paint, so we need to thin it down with some water and apply 1 or 2 layers to get a full coverage. Now it might seem odd that we're doing this, seeing as we've already undercoated with Wraithbone. We do this because the spray can has a slightly different finish to the paint from the pot, and if we do this, it just helps us tidy up any mistakes later on. You don't need to worry about being neat here at all. Just take your time and make sure you get into all those tricky to reach areas. Now we'll paint the black details using Black Templar. This is just the undersuit and a few other details around the miniature. For this we'll probably need a smaller brush, so a small layer brush works well here as this gives us a little bit more control. Just take your time and carefully get that paint into all those black details. Don't worry if you make any mistakes, that's why we've got the Wraithbone. We'll just thin that down and layer back over the mistake to correct it. When we use contrast over a light undercoat like this, it gives us a natural highlight, which is great if we don't want to spend loads of time edge highlighting later. Now we'll paint the chest eagle using Dark Angels Green. Again, this is a contrast paint, so we'll get that natural highlight coming through. When you're working with contrast paint, apply it heavily and neatly, being careful to control any excess pooling. Just be as neat as you can. Try not to get any onto that Wraithbone armour if you can, but don't worry if you make any mistakes, just tidy back up with Wraithbone. And with that done, our miniature is really starting to take shape. Now our Deathwing Terminator has a red weapon, so we'll be using Flesh Tearer's Red to paint this detail, and we'll also use this on any Purity Seal wax. This is a lovely deep red which will give us loads of depth on the miniature and contrast nicely against that bone armour. Again, using a contrast paint here means we'll get a natural highlight coming through. Just be careful to control any excess pooling. If you find it is pooling too much, just clean off your brush and use that to soak up any excess. On the gun casing, apply the paint heavily and neatly. Now we'll be painting the grey details using Celestra Grey. We'll be using this paint for the Crux Terminatus, and if your model's got any rocks on the base, we can use it for that too. This is a base paint, so again we need to thin it down and apply a couple of layers. We do this to avoid clogging up any of that fine detail. Now we use Corax White to paint any parchment. Painting it white will just add a little bit of variety to the miniature and help it stand out a bit. It's quite normal for paints to separate in the pot when they've been stood for a while. So make sure you give it a good shake before you open it and then apply it to the miniature. Also, don't forget to thin it down with a little bit of water first. Now for the silver details, we'll be using Lead Belcher. This is a metallic base paint, but we treat this like all the other base paints. Just make sure to thin it down and apply a couple of layers. If we do make any mistakes, we can always tidy them up, but it does save time if we're neater in the first instance. We'll be adding a wash over various details later, which will really help to add some depth and tie everything back together. Now we're on to our final base coat, and this is going to be Retributor armour for any gold details. Again, it'll take a couple of coats to get a full coverage, so just take your time and work your way around those details. If you're ever unsure of where to place certain colours, you can refer back to any box art or reference images. Once you've finished using metallic paints, it's always a good idea to change your paint water. This will avoid any of those shiny flakes in your water getting into any of your non-metallic paints. If this happens, we could end up accidentally getting some shiny flakes onto some of our miniature. And with all those base coats done, we're now going to move on to that iconic bone armour. For this, we'll be using Skeleton Horde and Contrast Medium. So, to achieve that bone armour effect, we're going to thin down 1 part Skeleton Horde with 1 part Contrast Medium. Then, using a slightly larger brush, we'll apply this all over the armour panels. When we're working with contrast over large areas, we need to apply it heavily and neatly, being careful to control any excess pooling. While the paint is still wet, we can easily move it around and take off any excess, but when it starts to dry, we might create texture if we start playing with the paint too much. This is why applying it heavily is the best way to go, as it increases the time that we've got to work with the paint on the miniature. The reason we've thinned this down is just to improve the flow of the paint, and it will be a little bit more subtle too. With the armour done, we can then use Skeleton Horde straight from the pot. We'll use this on any gold and parchment. This will be slightly darker and add more depth than it does on the rest of the armour. If you've got any skulls or anything on the base, don't forget to paint those too. And our final shade will be Nuln Oil. We'll be using this over the silver and the grey details. We can also add it over the black just to help tie everything together. This is a nice subtle shade which will just add a little bit of depth. Apply this just like your contrast, heavily and neatly, being careful to control any excess pooling. Now you can absolutely leave your Deathwing Terminator as it is. It already looks awesome and it's more than ready to head onto the gaming table. However, if you'd like to see a simple way to take this paint job up a notch, keep watching. The final thing we're going to do is apply an edge highlight of Wraithbone. For this we'll use a small layer brush and make sure to thin our paint down on the palette. We want the paint to glide effortlessly off the brush, but we don't want it to be too watery as it won't settle on the miniature correctly. When you're edge highlighting, it's entirely up to you how much or how little of it you want to do. You could just pick out the more prominent details, or you could work your way around the whole miniature, picking out more of those edges. We'll be using the edge of our brush to do these highlights, as this gives us a crisp and easy highlight with minimal effort. So just work your way around the miniature, picking out those hard edges and running the edge of our brush along it. Be as neat as you can here, but if you do make any mistakes, you can always tidy back up with the previous colours. Also, don't be scared to move the miniature around as much as you need to. Make sure you've got the best angle for you. Now, Wraithbone is a base paint, but we can absolutely use it to highlight with as well. And there we are, your Deathwing Terminator is more than ready to deploy into the heart of the foe and take them down. You can now go on to base your model and apply any relevant transfers. We've used Sterling Battlemire to base this miniature, and if you'd like to learn more about technical paints, you can check out our video all about them. For more tutorials, tips and tricks, you can head to your local Warhammer store where our amazing staff will be more than happy to help, or you can head on over to citadelcolour.com. Well, we hope you've enjoyed the video and we'll see you next time. Bye!